Welcome to Tea Time, my friends, a place where I muse about my gender transition experience and in the process aim to comfort and inspire others to a greater level of self-awareness. I am Artemis, enjoying a cup of Christmas cake tea, courtesy of the Rosenvine Gift Company. And we're going to have some fun today, dodging the YouTube algorithm axe as we discuss the emergence of a group of people calling themselves by the acronym of M.A.Ps, which stands for Minor Attracted Persons. It's the politically correct way of saying that, if sent to prison, they'd need their own security detail. It's the politically correct way of saying that they like the wine while still on the vine. It's the politically correct way of saying that they look for mates at playdates. All jokes aside, we're seeing this advocacy for the normalization of this behavior at the intersection of many different cultural, intellectual, and evolutionary biology conditions. And as per my usual, I'm going to wend my way through them all and then some to name and know the beast, and in doing so, hopefully tame it. The idea of a grown human acting as a predator to that which it once was is an uncomfortable subject for some, and as such, it seems that many people would rather just not talk about it. This practice of refusing to scrutinize taboo subjects serves only to leave it festering in the dark, in my opinion. On the other end of this rainbow, some of these things are taboo for a reason, and just because it can be talked about openly, this does not normalize it to the point of being acceptable or okay to be allowed to be acted out freely, methinks. Since we'll also be talking about a type of logical fallacy in this video, for anyone unfamiliar with the slippery slope fallacy, it means an argument made on the premise that if one thing is allowed, a series of other events in sequential order factually will follow. As in, I don't want to pay back my student loans, because if I do, the university will think that my degree in underwater basket weaving makes me money, and then more people will do it, and we'll have a society of nothing but underwater basket weavers, and civilization as we know it will collapse. So, let's first broach this beast from a coldly scientific perspective, from which comes just about all the empathy I have for people who identify themselves as a M.A.P. I try always first to identify points of compassion when attempting to find common ground with someone and build a bridge for cooperation. And I believe this is useful practice in general because often I see that we find ourselves in situations where we need to cooperate with someone we oppose in order to accomplish a greater goal, or at the very least get from point A to point B without the struggle of Sisyphus. So, for your consideration, I offer a potential explanation for someone who seems to have an innate attraction to Peter Pan and the gang. In current public discourse that is in defense of these individuals, very often they state that this attraction is something that they cannot help and is a sexuality that they were born with. Some may have developed this attraction as a result of trauma, in which case I would think that therapy might help to correct, and perhaps for some it does. For those whom therapy has not worked for, or for those who would rather revel in their default, I offer the following potential explanation. Perhaps the attraction really is genetically encoded. And when I think in terms of evolutionary biology, it makes sense to me that in the game of reproduction, that you'd naturally be drawn to individuals who are of reproductive potential, but also are young enough still to have the healthiest offspring and be around to care for said offspring. Like with any trait or behavior, though, it is my understanding that the genetic coding behind it always bears the potential for mutating, and the coding for what someone finds sexually attractive may be the same or similar. I believe that it's entirely possible that the coding responsible for identifying youthful mates has simply been dialed way down with the minor attracted person via a mutation. And following that logic, it would then stand to reason that this can happen on the other end of the spectrum too. We joke all the time about youthful women marrying old men just for their money, but perhaps this isn't always the case, and there may be genuine attraction in some of those instances. But gentlemen, I wouldn't bank on that being your retirement plan. My purpose of identifying a potential inborn or incurable cause of the sexual attraction of a M.A.P is not to excuse their behavior or drives in any way. On the contrary, if anything, it marks them as an individual to treat with extreme caution, knowing that potentially they are driven by subconscious behavior that they themselves refuse to take conscious control of for the safety and empathy of others. And this is where I think it's a good time to talk about the concept of toxic empathy and how the current culture of tolerance is encouraging these dangers from out of the shadows. For quick reference, when I say toxic empathy, I mean the practice of feeling such sympathy for the disadvantage of another that you would allow them to act however they wished in order to facilitate their feeling better, to the point of sacrificing others' health, freedoms, safety, and perhaps beyond. More on that shortly. It's also a feature of toxic femininity, the age I believe we're in which is the equal and opposite reaction to the toxic masculinity we saw for millennia. When Stonewall lobbied for and succeeded in decriminalizing homosexuality, they did so in pointing out that sexuality is not a choice, and when amongst consenting adults, sex is healthy. That is where I believe we hit a good social balance as it relates to the consideration of homosexuality itself. In the wake of this, and aiming to be more accepting and tolerant so as never again to cause such human misery in this way, I've observed the current cultural climate in many parts of the Western world to be accepting without question someone's declaration of self. I've heard people laud this as the progressive and loving thing to do, and much like the portion of the spectrum that minor attracted persons occupy, this new socio-cultural practice seems to me to have caused the slippery slope fallacy to become true, where what once was taboo for the long-term health of individuals and society is being seriously considered as a new potential reality. In my opinion, some things that were ever taboo at one point certainly benefited from societal reevaluation, like getting tattoos. But many other taboos that have passed through centuries of recorded human history exist for the reason that they have been tried and true rules to keep society from collapsing. Stay out of that elephant graveyard, Simba. In the current socio-political climate, I believe we are falling down the slippery slope of what I see as reason into unreason, with the observation that society's moral value has been placed heavily on tolerance of the individual for the sake of that individual's feelings, rather than a careful consideration of the overall health of the individuals affected, and then also the health of the many. From where I sit, it looks as though we failed to find a balance, the two extreme endpoints being the value of the individual on one side and the value of the societal collective in which we exist on the other. Throughout history, it has looked to me that cultural ideology trends far to one side over time due to a lack of consistently finding the middle-of-the-road option, and then, by law of physics, must find its equal and opposite in order to bring it back to stasis. It appears to me as though there is a current climate of toxic empathy, where not only is extreme tolerance upheld as a virtue to the point of detriment, but also that we allow a fixed trait in someone to excuse their subsequent behavior, a combination of destructive empathy, entitlement, and addiction to social power and or validation. An example for this video being, well, this person has a sexual attraction to minors, and since they cannot help it, we should find empathy for them by allowing them to solicit for their needs. This, I believe, accomplishes two things that feed off of one another. First, it removes the concept of personal responsibility, which secondarily leads to the infantilizing of the adult population. Ironically, in my estimation, this makes adults the mental equivalent of the children whom minor attracted persons pursue. In general, I think that this Peter Pan syndrome, adults regressing to the maturity or wants of a child, is something that is actually contributing further to the current socio-cultural climate of parents opting for puberty blockers for their children at the slightest hint of gender dysphoria or discomfort, and the roots of that go deep. M.A.Ps indignantly proclaim that their natural state should be accepted in this public climate of tolerance, typically invoking the argument used by homosexuals during the Stonewall era in that, well, if they can't help their sexuality and neither can I should be allowed to act as I please too. And there are many people out there nodding their heads in agreement to this logic, if for no other reason than that to object otherwise may be seen as cruel. Their logic is, by definition, insane, for this reason. The fallacy in their argument is one of false equivalency. Sex among mature adults is not the same as sex between a minor and an adult. We know from countless studies that most children, if not all, do not possess the same mental capacities as the average or even below average adult. And so while they all share the commonality of being human, they are not considered equal humans in the department of cerebral maturity. Innately, many of us understand this because our society operates in so many other areas a certain way with this in mind, such as no one under the age of 18 being permitted to purchase a movie ticket to see an R-rated film in a theater. We don't even allow them to see sexual activity on a screen, and yet many still struggle to draw the boundary against the M.A.P's flawed logic. You might even try to argue that our laws regarding this restriction are outdated or archaic, yet we need only to reference the studies highlighting the lack of functioning in the reasoning frontal lobe of our brains amongst those under 25 to support the caution against exposing children to sexual concepts. However, there have been groups of people in society for quite some time pushing for what they call the total liberation of humanity by calling for complete autonomy of children. Freedom, they believe, means giving children the ability to do as they choose, bestowing upon them the respect of that choice. Specifically, they meant sexual liberation, in that if someone asked them if they wanted to perform a sexual act and they agreed to it, it should be sanctioned, and that this was a great start to a society of equality. This is some of the foundation of what is being called the woke movement of today. And it may come as no surprise to you that the individuals who spouted this rhetoric, like Michel Foucault, in my opinion, were known proponents of decriminalizing sex with minors. It is my opinion that these individuals either knew of the harm that they caused children with this sexual exposure and didn't care because they were getting their needs met, or they truly believed, despite the seeming evidence we have to the contrary, that their idea of exposing children in this way was harmless. In either case, this is a group of people who clearly chose to expose sexually innocent and sexually immature human beings to sexually explicit activities and/or content. There may exist people who identify as M.A.Ps but choose never to act on these impulses because they recognize the harm that it would do. And I think it's important to acknowledge this possibility for many reasons we will discuss later. In the case of M.A.Ps, in general public discourse, we have actually proven the slippery slope fallacy to come true with the help of ideologues like Michel Foucault. In the comment section of a video I saw covering the Will Convert Your Children sing-along put out by the San Francisco Gay Men's Choir, someone described the series of events descending the slippery slope, and it went something like this. First, they paraded their sexuality in the streets. Then they wanted marriage rights. Then they wanted to force your pronoun usage. Then they wanted to educate your children. Then they were preying on your children. And as I have come to understand it, with a lack of ability to think logically and critically, as in identifying the logical fallacy of the M.A.P's argument and then stopping it there, we have taken the open acceptance of homosexuality and followed it down the slippery slope into the ideology of, and with that Big Mac, would you like a child's fry to go with it? Subjectively speaking, I believe that empathy and tolerance can be wonderful, beautiful things. And as with everything on this planet and in this reality, each has a version and an amount that are toxic or deadly. And if one wishes to avoid this, the ever-present goal is to find moderation, balance. Let's muse a little more about what may have gotten us to this destination, because if anyone's been paying attention, this might invoke the feeling of déjà vu. There is this saying that I'm reminded of, which is hard times create strong men create easy times create weak men, and weak men create hard times. Now, irrespective of sex, it does seem to me that there is this cycle of boom and bust when society seems to be flourishing and is no longer focusing on the day-to-day survival aspects of obtaining food, water, and shelter. All the previously suppressed ideas and behaviors come out of the box, followed thereafter by a collapse of some kind. I'm all for innovation, diversity, and some chaos in which creativity is born, and certainly appreciate that I can have anything I want delivered to my door in less than 2 days because of this. What an incredible time to be alive. What I wonder is if that collapse is really necessary. If, as a society, we could recognize the slippery slope when it's happening and find center before the reset button of doom is smashed. The most readily known example of this cycle of boom and bust was the Roman Empire, which towards the end of what was deemed an extremely opulent society, Nero was allegedly playing as Rome burned, and supposedly Caligula made his horse a member of the Senate. Personally, I think if we were to overlay that timeline to our own society, we would fall in right after Horseteeth being sworn to office and creepy Grandpa Tiberius leaning grossly close for an extra smooch from the kiddos. For those of you who aren't familiar, this was just about the end of the line for the Roman Empire. And the United States, in my opinion, has its very own versions of these stories. It's hard to know exactly what the causes of the downfall of Rome were, but for us in the States, I think the equation goes thus. In the wake of the horrors of World War II, we became more open to questioning and breaking down conditions that created more misery for people, and developed an allergy to discrimination and inequality, as well as finding a new cultural identity of peace, love, and tolerance. With such an economic boom as was experienced after the war, entitlement across the board slowly crept in and became the standard. On top of this, the discipline of evolutionary biology states that the default condition of any living thing that exists on this planet is to tend towards energy conservation. As in, if I don't have to do it, I'm not going to do it. I believe we are still living under the genetic programming that understood that every choice we made costs energy, and energy was not something we were guaranteed to be able to replenish. I'm not casting any shade or shame on this condition. In my opinion, it's simply time to be aware of it and work beyond it if we hope to break away from the cycles of the past. If you do what you've always done, you get what you've always got. To overcome this takes cognitive, conscious choice, a conscientiousness that many people are not yet employing in their lives, as evidenced by every unwanted hangover, midlife crisis, and unplanned pregnancy experienced today. It's just a simple fact of life that facilitates learning, and to do anything otherwise takes practice for most. C'est la vie. Now, despite my apocalyptic prophesizing, some of the features of this cultural shift aren't all bad as I see it, and I think in finding our way to logical center, we can take some key potential improvements with us. The appreciation and usefulness of diverse ideas, self-expressions, and the value placed on taking time for self-care. A different and perhaps healthier application of the word selfish. Previously, the value of the individual was obliterated in favor of the masses, all while forgetting that the masses are made up of individuals. We now have much greater emotional vocabulary, and we have allowed for conversations that previously remained bottled within each of us that created dis-ease. I think that's extraordinary growth worth celebrating and maintaining. To keep from sliding down this slippery slope in future forays into the unknown and unexplored, we can apply the principles of critical thinking and formal logic in order to navigate the often entirely subjective lines of feelings-based thought, while considering the emotional value of each individual topic. In the case of dealing with maps, I think the middle ground of all that we have learned throughout history to this point might look something like this. Their line of logic justifying their freedom to act falls apart with the slightest scrutiny and therefore is untenable. But we can still exercise some compassion for their position, supporting their individual bodily existence, assuming that they stay in conscious control of their genetic programming and without ever excusing them in toxic empathy if they knowingly chose to act in a way that would harm another individual or society as a whole. Further, if a MAP's desire really is something that they were born with and cannot change in that way, the often seen practice of calling them monsters, if they chose never to act on those impulses, I believe, would be tantamount to calling someone a murderer for every homicidal thought about their partner's ex. The label monster, of course, is extremely subjective, and the weight of a shoe to a flower could be considered monstrous. The straight definition of the word is something that is grotesque or frightening in appearance, which is also quite subjective, and we can even use the word differently to mean something that is evil or harmful in nature, a definition based on another subjective system of values. So it's not lost on me that this can get philosophically messy very, very quickly. For me, though, a monster actually chooses to act opposite of what the understood, healthy, comfortable, and desired boundaries, needs, and desires of others are. Because we all have the capacity and potential for monstrous acts given the triggering circumstance. And if the definition were based only on possibility, then we could all be labeled monsters. And perhaps we all are. It's just a label, and it only has as much power or meaning as we give it. And who's to say that Carl Jung's concept of the beast within that humans embody isn't worthy of such a label? But I digress. In this context of MAPs, in our current reality, I'm personally defining monster only as one who, in knowing opposition of the general social code and the harm that it can do, chooses to violate the romantic, sexual, and or psychological innocence of an individual who is likely to be or shows signs of being underdeveloped in critical thinking, sexual understanding, and emotional awareness. Furthermore, I've seen that shaming people for admitting their attraction, or shaming people in general for certain traits, promotes them to stay in the shadows and further contributes to the monsters in the dark. It's the universal law of, if this is what you expect, this is what you'll get. While the choice of a minor attracted person to act however they do is their own personal freedom, I think there is certainly more that can be done in a safe, balanced, and healthy way to mitigate the choice to act on their sexuality. Having compassion for the MAP who never acts on their impulse may help them to stay within society's graces and satisfies the humanitarian effort to embrace the fringes. However, in my philosophy, that line should be very clear in that if the impulse is ever acted upon, the consequences will be harsh and permanent, a total zero tolerance policy. It may help keep those that are on the fence from falling, and for those without conscience or would act in favor of their desire regardless, or would simply try to hide it to avoid consequence, there is still consequence for them. And just because we have compassion for the condition, again, this does not excuse actions. Trust them no more around children or adolescents than you would a drug addict around their drug of choice. But without action, monster label not. Something else that I mentioned quickly in the very beginning of this video, and in my opinion is a warning always to remember, is that there are humans who carry genetic code that produces and drives predatory behavior, and the number may be larger than estimated. In general, as a species that has been programmed to hunt intelligently another animal that would try to escape versus an herbivore that need only gather a sedentary food source, there will no doubt be those among us who can and will direct this lust towards its own species, whether that be for blood or sexual desire. think serial killers and practiced child violators. I find that humans, through blissful ignorance or intentional blindness, will refuse to take notes from the animal kingdom of these very same themes and suffer the consequences. I do not aim to dwell in paranoia and paint humans with a broad brush of such horror, and instead it is my aim to keep aware of possibilities and make judgments on a case-by-case basis with the evidence in front of me. I admit entirely here that there may not be a single map who would benefit from this sort of razor's edge societal compassion to be able to contribute to my proposed standards as a healthy and functioning member of society. Or it would be such a small number that to try to employ this mindset equates to a losing cost-benefit analysis. That being said, as a distinct possibility, our current model of handling maps may just be the overall subjectively best solution, which is with a Sauron-sized side-eye and jail time. I make no hard assertion either way. Part of the point of this video was to reveal a few blind spots that I see society as a whole falling victim to through the lens of the MAP movement, which are: 1, we fail to find balance between logic and feelings, often leading us to prove the slippery slope fallacy actually true. Number 2, we often have trouble finding empathy for that which we've decided to despise. And if we do find empathy, again, we fail to find the balance line and extend it to a toxic level. And 3, I believe it is a useful exercise in framing judgments when we can separate within a group those who make choices based only on their own selfish needs and those who make decisions with respect to both others and themselves, versus lumping the category based on a characteristic and judging them all the same. In this case, the MAPs who choose never to act on their impulses and those that act with abandon for others. There is one last closing point that I feel is crucial to accentuate. While many, if not all, MAP activists would like to associate themselves with the LGBT and T people in order to normalize their sexuality in society, my aim is to ensure that anyone looking upon the non-heteronormative group be able to treat individuals on a case-by-case basis, rather than associating the MAP's sexuality with all of the LGBT and T. I, for one, want no association with anyone trying to normalize pedo behavior, philosophies, urges, or agendas. It seems to me that it is easy for people to develop an opinion about the whole rather than the parts within. And it's in practicing investigating nuance that I believe we can grow as beings and transcend this swinging pendulum of left and right to rest comfortably somewhere in the middle.